Thank you, Pastor Britta. Thank you, kids. Have you ever fallen in love with a song? Fallen in love with a song so hard that you just have to have it? Now, today, of course, there are lots of ways for you to have a song. All the streaming services and YouTube and the radio. I mean, if you listen to songs on the radio, does anybody do that anymore? Okay. It used to be a little bit harder because, like, pretty much the radio or maybe television would be where you would hear a new song, and then if you didn't want to wait for it to come around in rotation on the radio, which, like, maybe if a song was popular, it would get played, 2 or 3 times a day, but you'd have to be there to hear it. You couldn't decide when it was going to play like you can now. Anyway, if you didn't want to wait for the rotation, then you would have to buy the song on a piece of vinyl called a record. You could buy the song by itself. Those were called 45s, 45 RPM. That's because they spun around on the turntable at 45 revolutions per minute. Okay, or you could get the album that the song was on, 33 1/3 revolutions per minute, and a bunch of other songs along with it. So some of this was a budgetary consideration of did you just want to buy the 45, have the song, and then whatever they put on the other side of it, or did you want to have the whole record? For me, sometimes when there was a song that I was really captured by and I wanted to have the song, if there was some sort of a holiday coming up or a birthday or something, I could ask for the album. It was easier to ask for the album. And then I'd get the whole thing. So, like, one time that was the Hollies. He Ain't Heavy, He's My Brother. And I got that album for Easter one year. And so then when you got the album, sometimes the rest of the album was in the same style as that one song, and it was like pretty much as good or almost as good. It felt like it all went together. Other times, that song that you heard on the radio was like nothing like anything else on the album. Sometimes that was okay, and sometimes that was not so okay. You wouldn't really connect with the album. But in those times where you loved the song, you got the album, you loved the album. So now you're thinking about the artist or the band or whoever this was, and you're thinking, what else have they done? And maybe you get another album, and maybe you really start to get into this. Now, in some cases, some of these artists would have more difficult recordings. Let's say Miles Davis. Let's say somewhere, you happen to be listening to FM radio and you heard All Blues by the Miles Davis group, and it just stuck with you. It's like, man, that's cool. So you get the album, Kind of Blue. Wow, this whole thing just feels so cool. And it's like, I can really enter into this, and I can't believe I'm listening to jazz. But this is working. So then you start to reach out into some of the other records that Miles produced. And you realize, ooh, some of these are harder to listen to, because Miles really enjoyed that, making things hard sometimes. And so then you're faced with the decision. Do you love this artist enough to stick with a difficult recording and listen long enough to where it begins to make sense? Or do you just set it aside, give it away? I remember I was really into a group called Yes, and found my way to them through a song, Roundabout. Heard the song on the radio, thought, I cannot believe something this cool exists. And then listening to the album, Fragile, going on from there to Close to the Edge, and just, it's so beautiful, just so awesome. Well, along the way, then I went a little deeper into their catalog, and I got an album called Relayer. It was hard. It was a difficult album. And I remember a friend of mine, a drummer named Joe Martino, who was really into Yes, and he already had that album, Relayer, for a while. He said, give it 6 months. Just give it 6 months. So I kept listening to it. It didn't take 6 months before it started to make sense to me. And now it's one of my favorite albums ever, anywhere. Do you know what I'm talking about? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes should not perish but have everlasting life. That's a hit song. That's a song you could love. But when you buy the album and you go a little deeper into the catalog, there's some hard stuff. There's some hard stuff. Reading the Bible can be a dangerous business. It can be perilous to actually read and not skip over stuff and not, create your own Reader's Digest version of the Bible. And today, we are going to look at one of the hard passages. Another metaphor that I'll put in front of you is digging a hole. Have you ever been digging in your yard and the shovel goes clink and you've hit a stone? Kind of move the shovel around, loosen up the stone, and most of the time it's, maybe softball size, avocado size, maybe a little bit bigger, but you can, loosen it up. But sometimes it's clink, and it just has that resonance where oh man, I'm in for something here, and it's not loosening at all. And so now you're trying to dig around the edge of the stone and trying to pry it with the shovel, and it's not moving. You got to keep digging around, and then some of these stones, you're going to have to go to the shed and get your crowbar, because you're going to need a little more leverage to try to get this thing loosened up. Sometimes it takes a long time. Sometimes it's not even going to be in that day that you have found this big stone. You're going to have to keep going back and working at it, loosening it up. Sometimes you might need help, right? Making some headway with it. And if you do get it loosened up, it's probably going to be bigger than what you can safely manage on your own. So you might need some help to move it out of the way. This is one of those passages. So let's just dive in. I want to pray first, and then we're going to read this passage together. Creator God, please open up your word to us, and please open us up to your word. Amen. Okay, Mark chapter 8, verse 31 through chapter 9, verse 1. Let's stand together, as is the custom in some places when reading a gospel passage. This contains words that are ascribed to Jesus himself, so we show respect by standing as we read. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." And he said to them, "Truly, I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see that the kingdom of God has come with power." The word of the Lord. Please be seated. In my mind, there are 3 troublesome bits in this passage. Maybe there are more. There are 3 that stand out to me. First of all, does Jesus really call Peter Satan? Second of all, if you want to follow Jesus, you have to deny yourself and take up your cross. Oof. Third, is Jesus really going to be ashamed of me? Of you? Of us? Is Jesus going to be ashamed? It's not going to help us to read past these things. It's also not going to help us to try to excuse them, but I'm hoping it will help us if we really look, if we just take some time and look at what the context is and what's being said and try to discern what Jesus means, bearing in mind who we know Jesus is from the testimony of the rest of the New Testament. So last week, Pastor Paul preached a sermon on who do you say I am? Jesus asked his disciples, who do you say I am? First he asked, who do people say I am? And then he said, who do you say I am? And Peter says, you're the Christ, you're the Messiah, the anointed one. Gold star for Peter. He hit that one out of the park. And then Jesus says, yeah, you got it. Don't tell anybody. I used to think that don't tell anybody was because Jesus was trying to pace his days on earth, and he didn't want his identity to be known too soon because that might accelerate the crucifixion, whatever. I'm not so sure about that anymore. I think maybe he told his disciples, don't tell anybody, because he knew they had a dangerously incomplete understanding of what the Messiah was. And if they started talking about it, they would probably imbue it with their own incomplete understanding of what it meant that Jesus was the Christ. And one of the reasons I think that is because the very next thing that happens, and it is the very next thing. This is not one of those cases where there's a scene cut, and now we're, a few weeks or a few months away. The very next thing is, verse 31, Jesus is saying, I'm going to suffer. And suffer many things and be rejected by all of the people that matter in Israel. And be killed. And after 3 days rise again. He's rounding out their understanding of what the Christ is. That's why this is here in this verse following Peter's gold star declaration. Jesus is saying, yes, you're right. I'm the Messiah, but you don't fully know what that means. You got the whole glory and triumph part of it. You got the winning part of it. You haven't rounded it out with the self-giving love, the cross. So Peter calls him aside after he says this. And it's interesting, too, because verse 32 says, he spoke plainly about this. Why is that worth a comment? Like, why is that worth Mark putting it into the book? He spoke openly about this. He spoke plainly about this. Because that was striking. That was what he was not supposed to do. You're not supposed to show weakness in public in this Greco-Roman context. This was unusual, to say the least, that Jesus is speaking openly about this stuff. Peter calls him aside to rebuke him. I used to think that was because Peter was being respectful of his rabbi and this person who he's just recently said, you're the Messiah. So he's showing some respect by taking him aside. Not so sure anymore. I think he was embarrassed. I think he was embarrassed by what Jesus was saying. He was ashamed of this part of the message. He didn't want to be associated with it. He didn't want it. He didn't want it. So he's taken Jesus aside to quietly, personally rebuke him. What does Jesus do? The first thing he does. What is the first thing he does? Do you remember? He turns back to the disciples. Okay? He's leaving this little private conversation with Peter. He's turning to his disciples. And then he says, get behind me, Satan. What's going on here? What's going on here? Can you think of another example of an incomplete picture of the Jesus Messiahship? How about the temptation in the desert? Jesus goes out into the desert for 40 days to fast and to pray. And the devil comes to him and tempts him. What does he tempt him with? You're hungry. Turn these stones into bread. Why? Don't put off your appetites. Satisfy your appetites now. All of what Satan is saying to Jesus in the desert is about hurry. It's about hurrying. It's about hastening the good stuff. So he's saying, don't be hungry, don't wait. And then he says, I can give you all the kingdoms. I can give you all the stuff. Kind of. What Satan could give Jesus was not the kingdom of self-giving love. It was the kingdom of self-aggrandizement. It was the kingdom of self first and grabbing power where you can find it and leaning into privilege and exceptionalism. Same thing when he said, throw yourself off of this pinnacle and, God will send the angels to keep you from being destroyed. Lean into your specialness. Make a show of how big a deal you are. That's what's happening in the misunderstanding of the disciples. They want him to hurry into his glory. They don't want him to talk about self-giving love. They don't want to hear anything about a cross. At the end of Luke's account of the temptation in the desert, do you remember what it says? After Satan has finished tempting Jesus, he waited for an opportune time. He left him until an opportune time. It was not over. It was not over. When I look at this interaction between Jesus and the disciples about what his Christness means, it's an opportune time. It's an opportune time. Because they only have part of the picture, and a partial understanding can be really dangerous. If you make the God you're worshiping out of a partial picture, and then you follow that God that you've made out of your incomplete understanding, that's a recipe for disaster. So is it surprising that in that moment, Jesus said, "Get thee behind me, Satan"? It's not surprising to me. He's not calling Peter Satan, because less than a week after that statement is made, Peter is one of 3 people that Jesus invites to a secluded place to witness a revelation of his glory that is transcendent. It's called the Transfiguration. And it's what follows right after the last verse of our passage today. So it's that first part of chapter 9. It's this picture of the revelation of Jesus' glory. So, Jesus is saying, what Satan is offering is not the way to that glory. So what comes next is, in verse 34, we see that Jesus invites the crowd to gather with his disciples. So now he's talking with everybody, anybody who wants to listen. So it's not just his disciples, not just the ones who have signed on and they're committed to this. kind of interesting that, a few paragraphs ago, he said, don't tell anybody about this, which is another reason that I think he's wanting to make sure they get a more complete, a fuller understanding of what's going on. Because now he's telling everybody. And what he's giving is more specifics about this complete picture. And he's doing it in a way that is inclusive. He's not just saying, this has to happen to me. He's saying, follow me and join me in this. and so if anyone wants to be my disciple, they must deny themselves and take up their cross. The deny themselves, really interesting in Greek. It's one word, and it's heiautou. And it has to do with an inner concept of, like, your perspective from within yourself. And there are only a few other places that it's used. And one of them is in a parable that Jesus is giving. And he's describing a Pharisee and a tax collector who are going into the temple to make an offering. All right? He says, two men went up to the temple to pray. This is from Luke's Gospel, chapter 18. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Actually, do we have this, Byron? Yeah, great. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people. Robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. So he stood off by himself, and he's thinking these things in his head. Now, he is so invested in his own view of himself and other people that he's praying his condescending attitude. He's praying this condescending judgment of other people. He's putting it in his prayer. I mean, wow. All right, well, another place that the word is used is John 5:19. So we can look at that one too, Byron. Jesus gave them this answer. Very truly, I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can do only what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. Same word. Heiautou. It's the word, the Son can do nothing by himself. By himself. The word has to do with in his own understanding. Okay? To me, this is thunderous. It's huge. That Jesus is using the same concept of himself. Of course, it's in a very positive way. He is acknowledging he's not going to do his ministry from here, from his own conclusions and categories. He's waiting for the Father. He's open. He is embracing an honest openness to what God is revealing to him, how God is leading him. That is the word in deny themselves. That is what Jesus is talking about. He is saying, if you want to follow me, I'm going to blow your mind. I am going to blow your mind. I was talking with Mark yesterday about this, and he held up a sweatshirt of The Chosen, if some of you are familiar with the Chosen series. And he turned it around, and on the back, it has one of the things that Jesus says in that series, which is, get used to different. Get used to different. He's saying, if you want to follow me, if anyone wants to be my disciple, let them deny themselves. Okay, let them get out of their head. Let them get out of their assumptions and judgments and categories and conclusions. Because you don't understand what the Messiah is yet. I'm telling you more about what this is. I'm telling you more about who I am, because that matters to who you are and who you're becoming. So you're going to have to get out of this in order to be able to start to embrace what it means to worship a Messiah who lives by the law of self-giving love. And he talks about the cross. You got to remember, when Mark wrote this, he knew about the cross. But in this particular moment, it was before Jesus went to the cross. It was like there was no sense of rhyme and reason of like how this all fit together. We read it and it's hard for us to read, but we can kind of see the poetry of it, They had nothing. They just knew this is an instrument of torture and shame and embarrassment, and it's not what we want to bring along in this journey of following Jesus. Here's the thing. The whole Jesus is calling the whole you. The whole Jesus is calling the whole you. It isn't just a thing of like, yeah, follow me and get ready because it's going to be really hard just because you're following me. You're going to get across. I think part of what's going on here is he's saying, follow me with everything you are. Follow me with everything that you must bring along with that if you're going to be honest. If you're going to be honest, if you're going to get out of your own, preferred concept of who you are, you're going to have to bring your crosses. You're going to have to bring the things that you don't want to carry. Things about who you are, things about how you've lived, things about your family of origin, things about where you are in life and the things that you haven't done yet, that you're starting to wonder if you ever will. Regrets, dreams, hopes, griefs. Bring it. If you're going to follow me, Jesus says, take up your cross. Come on. I don't want a tidied up version of you. I don't want what you wish you were. I don't want this edited version, this social media version, right? Your influencer version, where you get to take a bunch of selfies and pick the one that looks best. And the whole Jesus is calling the whole you to follow. All right, so what about the shamed thing? Leading into that part where Jesus says, if you're ashamed of the Son of Man here in this context, then the Son of Man will be ashamed of you in the glory. Leading up to that, we have the thing of what's it going to profit you if you lose your soul in the process of gaining the whole world? And then also, if you lay down your life, if you lose your life, you gain it. Whereas if you try to preserve it, in doing that, you lose it. He's setting up inversions. Jesus is setting up inversions. Jesus loved topsy-turvy. Jesus loved flipping things. It's very important right now in this particular conversation that he's doing because it pertains to who he's saying he is as the Messiah. He's saying you got to flip that over because it's about self-giving love. There's glory. Yes, it's the best when God says, this is my son. I love him. Listen to him. It's the best when God says, well done, thou good and faithful servant. It's the best when all of that glorious stuff happens. But you don't clutch at that. You don't grasp at that. You don't hurry that. The way to that is self-giving love. The context of all of that is self-giving love, which of course is upside down to the Greco-Roman culture and to our culture and to any culture. Because what we're driven toward is to basically, it's to pursue what's nice for self. To the point where we can lose touch with what self actually is, with our own personhood, because we're concentrating on trying to support it and buffer it and make things nice for it. And Jesus is saying, pay attention to the personhood itself. It's not about this other stuff and this whole system of preserving your own concept of things and your own, bubble of niceness for yourself. It's flipping that. And so I think what's going on, I mean, there's nothing else in our revelation of who Jesus is that would indicate that he would be doing a tit for tat. Well, if you're ashamed of me, I'm going to be ashamed of you. Right? I mean, if we're going to use canonical interpretation, meaning if we're going to use the Bible to help us understand the Bible, there's nothing that would support that. Given that he's just set up all these things of inversions, I'm pretty sure that what's going on here is Jesus is saying, all right, I embarrassed you. When I started talking about suffering and being rejected and being killed, I embarrassed you. When I brought crosses into it, I really embarrassed you. You were ashamed of that. It's not speculation. They were ashamed. Peter called them aside. He said, don't do that. So Jesus is saying, in your context, these things that I just said are embarrassing. If you're given to this context. If you're going to accept the values of this context, then what I just said is shameful. But guess what? When I come in my glory, and the context is self-giving love, what's embarrassing then? Self-aggrandizement, self-centeredness, self-first, seizing power, hurrying to the good stuff. That's embarrassing, right? In that picture, like if you imagine yourself in this context of self-giving love, where the way of Jesus is the way, anything that's upside down to that is going to stand out and look weird. I think that's what's happening. And I think Jesus is using very strong language to convey that. Okay. We need to bring this plane in for a landing. Significantly, my reading of this passage has been impacted by a passage from the epistle to the Philippians, written by the Apostle Paul. I see a remarkable parallel between these passages. And so let's read this together. Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Isn't that something? Resist hasty conclusions that play into selfish ambition and vain conceit. Cultivate an honest openness to the Spirit of God, knowing that such an openness will sometimes ask you to reorient in ways that are not comfortable. Pastor Paul, would you help me out?